As a German, I was shocked when I saw this section on a forum for the first time here in the US. Turns out this is super common here, but in Germany, this would be illegal. So let's talk about race in the US compared to Germany. Hallo, Servus, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Feli. I'm originally from Munich, Germany, but I've been living here in Cincinnati, Ohio, on and off since 2016. When you move abroad, you constantly find yourself in new situations. Simple, everyday things like grocery shopping, pumping gas, or eating out at a restaurant might suddenly work differently than what you were used to at home. So naturally, you'll go through a lot of firsts at the beginning. I remember watching my first ever American football match, the first time I went to a frat party, and yes, it was just like in the movies, going through a drive-through ATM for the first time, and being asked about my race and ethnicity for the first time in my life. That was a moment that definitely raised a lot of questions for me. Is this legal? Is this discriminatory? Why do they need to know this? I had never heard of a person being asked for their race before. And while I was used to being a foreigner here, you know, having the role of the German exchange student and having to select a different nationality on forms, I was kind of thrown off when I had to state on a form that I was white. Or at least I just assumed that that was the right category for me. I mean, it doesn't get much paler than this, so that's what I selected. I also remember that on some of these forms, the word Caucasian came up, so I just quietly looked up what that meant because I had never heard that term before and I didn't want to have to ask. It means white-skinned or of European descent, by the way, and is sometimes listed on these forms instead of white. For those of you not from the US, the options on these types of forms usually look something like this: American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and white. Sometimes you'll also see options like other or two or more races. Or in some other cases, like here on the official US Census from 2020, they give you a few more specific options, including Asian Indian, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Guamanian or Chamorro, Samoan, other Asian, or other Pacific Islander. But most of the forms I've seen usually just have the basic categories. In addition to this, they also usually specifically ask for people's ethnicity, where all they want to know is whether you're Hispanic or Latino, yes or no. On the 2020 census, they went into a little more detail again and wanted to know from those who checked yes, where their roots are from specifically, but most of the time it's just yes or no. These type of questions come up pretty regularly here in the US, I would say, especially when you're new to the country and have to register for a bunch of things. But I definitely had to answer this at university, on the US Census obviously, every time you go to a new doctor and have to fill out all of your information. Then I think in some states they ask this when you apply for your driver's license, and it's often part of job applications too. It even sometimes shows up on these customer satisfaction surveys when they ask for your demographics at the end. Now, of course, scientifically speaking, there are no human races. All humans belong to the species Homo sapiens, and at this point in time, humans haven't yet developed any subspecies that come with inherently different character traits, skills, or intelligence. That's why the US Census Bureau stresses on their website that the race categories they use on their forms, quote, generally reflect a social definition of race. The categories are not an attempt to define race biologically, anthropologically, or genetically. They also emphasize that it's all based on self-identification, so there's no one that will tell you that whatever category you picked is wrong or anything like that, and respondents can mark more than one race on the form to indicate racial mixture. And as far as I know, you're never required to answer those questions if you don't want to. I think you can always pick other if that's an option, or sometimes it'll also say decline to self-identify or something along those lines. This video is sponsored by Private Internet Access. I love that they're ready to support even my more serious videos. If you've always wondered how you can watch TV shows and movies on Netflix even though they're not available in your country, the answer is with a VPN. I personally use Private Internet Access, short PIA, because they're the best value VPN on the market and have servers in over 90 countries all over the world and in all 50 US states, which means that I can access content that's on the Japanese Netflix, or the Australian one, or the German one. One of my guilty pleasure shows that I turn on when I'm not feeling so good, for example, is Gossip Girl, which you can watch on Netflix if you set your location to the UK. That's also how you can watch one of the best rom-coms ever made, in my opinion, The Devil Wears Prada, or all 10 seasons of Friends. Of course, this also works with other streaming platforms and TV channels. And at the same time, PIA helps secure your internet connection and your personal data because it encrypts your signal and hides your IP address, which is why when I take out my laptop at the airport or at a hotel, the very first thing I do is always turn on PIA because you never know who can hack into your computer in these public Wi-Fi networks. And PIA has decided to give my viewers the first 4 months completely for free. To claim this offer, just go to piavpn.com/Feli from Germany or click on the link in the info box. And even after the first 4 months, you'll get 83% off, which means it'll only cost $2.03 a month, and you can install it on an unlimited amount of devices. It's an insane deal, so don't miss it. piavpn.com/Feli from Germany. Now, the reason why I had never seen a question like this before I came to the US or been asked about my race or color of skin, and why I was kind of shocked by this at first, is that those type of questions are actually illegal in Germany and haven't been common since the end of World War II. This includes any type of statistic based on race or ethnicity, but also asking about it during a job application process would not be allowed in Germany. Now, the main reason for this is, of course, German history and the so-called Rassenlehre or Rassenkunde, so racial theories that the Nazis used to justify their discrimination against certain groups of people and eventually their genocide. Now, these theories weren't invented by the Nazis. They were already pretty widespread in the 19th and early 20th century, but Hitler and the National Socialist Party made them even bigger and used them as a foundation of their ideology. They basically deemed certain human races inferior to others and referred to them as Untermenschen, so subhumans. This included Jewish people, Romani, Black people, as well as Slavic and Arabic people, among others, while the so-called Aryan race was considered the superior master race. As part of what they called Rassenhygiene, racial hygiene, or Erbpflege, they basically pursued selective breeding of people with these Aryan or Nordic traits. In the Nuremberg laws that were passed in 1935, they explicitly banned marriages and extramarital intercourse between Jews and Germans. I'm putting Germans in quotation marks because obviously most of these Jewish people were German too. And a few months later, this was expanded to Romani and Black people too. They also revoked the citizenship of everyone who didn't have German or related blood, according to them. In addition to that, they made sure that the genes of people they deemed undesirable due to incurable illnesses or physical or mental disabilities weren't carried on. They conducted forced sterilizations and abortions, and over 200,000 people were straight up murdered as part of the Nazis' euthanasia program. This also included around 5,000 infants, children, and adolescents. And obviously, discrimination and anti-Semitism in particular was also very present in public life. Jewish people were stripped of their civil rights. They were excluded from certain professions, were violently attacked and harassed. Their businesses were boycotted, destroyed, or taken from them, and books, music, and art that was considered un-German was destroyed and banned. People were also forced to publicly identify themselves as Jewish by wearing the Judenstern, in English referred to as the yellow badge, and starting in 1938, Jewish people who didn't already have a stereotypical Jewish first name were forced to add the first name Israel or Sarah. just to name a few things. As you all know, this discrimination eventually ended with millions of people systematically being deported and murdered in concentration camps and extermination camps. By the end of World War II, over 17 million people had been killed due to the Nazis' twisted racial ideologies and other motives. This included 6 million Jews, almost 9 million non-Jewish Soviet and Polish people, Serbian civilians, Romani, disabled and ill people, criminals and homeless people, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and political opponents, among others. Needless to say, these racial theories are completely obsolete today and don't hold up to any modern scientific standards. I think it makes sense that due to this history, Germany feels particularly responsible for never letting anything like this happen ever again. And in order to avoid any type of discrimination based on your race or ethnicity, this type of information simply doesn't show up on forms and in official systems in Germany. And as a result, I think this might not exist in people's heads as much either, but we'll talk about that more in a second. Now, unlike in English, where race is a commonly used term to this day, the German equivalent, Rasse, has gained kind of a negative connotation over the last few decades, at least when used in regards to people, and you don't really hear it being used in everyday life anymore. Which probably has to do with the fact that most Germans mainly associate the word with the Nazi ideology and terms like Rassenkunde, and the horrible outcomes that this type of human classification resulted in. But I feel like it also has to do with the fact that in German, the word Rasse also means breed when talking about animals. And that's the context the word is still commonly used in, which I think automatically makes it sound kind of degrading when it's then used to talk about humans as well. Nevertheless, the word Rasse actually shows up in some of our most important legal documents in Germany, including our constitution, the Grundgesetz. In the third section of the Constitution regarding discrimination, it says, niemand darf wegen seines Geschlechtes, seiner Abstammung, seiner Rasse, seiner Sprache, seiner Heimat und Herkunft, seines Glaubens, seiner religiösen oder politischen Anschauungen benachteiligt oder bevorzugt werden. Niemand darf wegen seiner Behinderung benachteiligt werden. So no person can be favored or disfavored because of sex, parentage, race, language, homeland and origin, faith, or religious or political opinions. No person can be disfavored due to their disability. And this has actually sparked extensive public debates over the last few years. The big question has been, do we really want a controversial term like Rasse in our constitution? Isn't it time to replace it with something more scientifically accurate and less negatively connotated? The German state of Saarland actually went ahead and erased the word from their state constitution earlier this year. However, the federal government just announced in February that after years of wanting to change this word in the German constitution, they're dropping these plans now due to how complicated this would be legally and because the Zentralrat der Juden, the Central Council of Jews in Germany, has voiced their doubts about this step. After all, in a way, the word Rasse commemorates the persecution of millions of people in Germany, and they said that's something that should never disappear from our collective memory. And erasing it from our constitution could be a step in that direction, in their opinion. And some people from the Afro-German community have similar thoughts. Dr. Natasha Kelly, who's written several books about racism in Germany, said, "I don't think that it would do anyone justice to replace or remove it." As I said earlier, when I was asked about my race for the first time here in the US, it automatically kind of raised some red flags in me. I was kind of like, are they really classifying people by their skin color or the shape of their eyes? Isn't this like racism 101? Those were kind of my first thoughts as someone who grew up in Germany. But I quickly learned that the reason why data about race and ethnicity is collected in the US is actually to fight racism. The idea is that in order to decrease racism and discrimination, you need to identify it first. And without collecting this data, there wouldn't be any statistics showing us that there are in fact significant racial disparities. in US healthcare, for example. Studies show that the life expectancy of Black people in the US is nearly 5 years shorter than that of white people. They have a higher rate of being uninsured compared to white people, they're more likely to go without care due to cost, and the mortality rate of Black infants is more than 2 times higher compared to white infants. Also, Black people are nearly 3 times more likely to die due to pregnancy-related reasons, and the list goes on and on. Now, there are many different reasons that might contribute to these disparities, such as generational poverty caused by historical discrimination in the US, or subconscious biases that medical professionals might have towards Black patients, or the fact that many Black people don't trust the medical system as much because they've experienced institutional racism and are underrepresented among the healthcare workforce. At the end of the day, if we don't know that these issues exist and where they lie exactly, how can they be addressed, right? Also, members of minority groups can often qualify for certain government programs or scholarships in the US. And of course, in order to receive those, their race or ethnicity data needs to be recorded somewhere. Many universities here offer free college tuition to Native Americans, for example. The goal of these types of programs is to make up for the generational disadvantages that many minority groups are dealing with in comparison to many white families in the country. So basically, we're seeing 2 countries that both have a pretty difficult history with racism, as we all know. In the US, this includes the removal of Native Americans, institutional slavery, Jim Crow laws, and the civil rights movement in the 1960s. In Germany, among other things, the history of the Third Reich. And both countries are trying to prevent and fight that type of discrimination today, but they have very different approaches to do so. The US actively tries to collect data about race and ethnicity to make disparities and inequalities visible and therefore make it easier to eliminate them. Germany, on the other hand, doesn't ask about ethnicity and race at all, so that people can't be discriminated against based on that information. I personally think that both lines of thinking make sense in a way, but they also both come with certain advantages and disadvantages. Growing up in Germany, I feel like I never really thought in categories of race, at least not in the way that it's used here in the US. And maybe that's just a me thing? Fellow Germans, let me know in the comments below if you can relate or not. But as far as I remember, this was never really a topic that would come up. And I don't even know if that's a good or a bad thing. But in the US, I feel like most people, when they see someone, can immediately tell whether that person is Black or half Black or Hispanic or Native American or white, etc., which is something that I never really thought about before I moved here. One time I really noticed this was during my first semester here when I was talking to an American friend about a YouTuber, and we weren't quite sure if we were talking about the same person, so he said something like, "Is she the one that's half Black?" And I remember how I had to think about it for a moment because I had never drawn that conclusion. I was kind of like, yeah, I think so. She might be. Or I also remember when I watched the American TV show Scrubs as a teenager in Germany, there's one episode where someone calls the character of Carla Black.
I gotta thank you for taking a special interest in this.
Don't give him too much credit. He's just excited because he wishes he dated more sexy Black women when he was single.
Well, at least he married one.
Todd, I'm not Black.
Right, and I'm not straight.
Fluttering has stopped.
There. Is she?
And I remember being kind of like, wait, what do you mean? Isn't she? Her skin is pretty tan, but she's actually from the Dominican Republic and a proud Latina. And this might sound pretty ignorant to a lot of Americans now, and I don't blame you, but I didn't really grow up with an awareness of how a Latina might look different from a person that's half Black or a quarter Black. It also took me a while to fully understand that being Black in the US doesn't just mean that you have a darker skin complexion or a certain hair type, but that it's a term that's particularly used for people whose ancestors were brought to this country as slaves, which of course comes with a whole lot of history of suppression and trauma and a collective identity. And especially during the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, I learned a lot about how important it is to many members of the Black community to be perceived as Black or a person of color, and how important it can be to actively recognize the differences and recognize the white privilege that even I, as a foreigner in this country, have, and the discrimination that many non-white people experience. Now, I'm not trying to say that before I came to the US, I didn't see color, right? Like, of course, I would notice if someone had a darker skin tone than myself, but for me growing up, that didn't really tell me much about the person. Because a person with tan skin could have been from Southern Europe somewhere, or from South America, or they could have been half black, but even that wouldn't tell me much. Like, a black person in Germany could be from the US, or from France, or from an Asian country, or directly from an African country, or they could just straight up be from Germany and some of their ancestors came from somewhere else. Who knows? I feel like in Germany, it always seemed to matter more where a person grew up, where and how they were socialized, what languages they grew up with, etc. Religion also played a role, of course. Some of the kids that were Muslim at my school wore a hijab, for example. Some of them didn't eat pork and didn't drink any alcohol. So of course, those were things that we asked about and talked about with our classmates. And of course, color of skin was a topic as well to some extent. I remember talking to my friends whose families were from a country in Southern Europe about how easily they tan in the summer. Or I had a classmate from Sri Lanka who was black and he always kind of made jokes about it and would say things like, "What do you mean I got the answer wrong? Come on now, just because I'm black." It's not like those things weren't a topic at all, but I never felt like that was the crucial aspect that people cared about. I think the how were you socialized and did you grow up with the same pop culture as me always seemed to matter more when it came to forming groups and friendships. If I had to break it down, I would probably say that the biggest social categories that seemed to matter when I went to school in Germany were people who had a Migrationshintergrund, as we say in German, so those with a migration background, whose families came to Germany from a different country and who grew up with a different culture at home, who possibly spoke a different language with their family than they did at school, and those who were just German. I sometimes felt like the just Germans were perceived as not quite as cool and interesting. At least I always felt a lot less cool growing up because I didn't have an interesting backstory. But now, looking back as an adult, I obviously realized that a lot of those stories came with a bunch of struggles and trauma. Now, naturally, kids who grow up with a similar background and similar challenges tend to befriend each other more quickly, just like I always enjoyed having other expats as friends here in the US because they shared a lot of the same culture shocks and experiences. But honestly, at least at my school, where we had students with all kinds of backgrounds, whether their families were originally from Turkey or Vietnam or the Balkans or Afghanistan, Pakistan, Greece, Albania, and so on, I feel like over the years, friend groups ended up mostly forming around personality traits and interests. I can think of so many friend groups at my school that were completely mixed in terms of their family background. At least that's how I remember it and how I perceived it in my personal bubble. But again, I'd love to hear how other people from Germany experienced this, so please let me know in the comments below. And maybe this is just a thought of mine, so bear with me. Maybe that actually does, to some extent, go back to the fact that we don't really use the word Rasse anymore, and generally don't really talk about the concept of race. Because the way we use language can have such a strong influence on the way we perceive the world. Just think of the way we perceive colors, for example. If you grew up with English as your first language, or German or Spanish, you'd probably agree that these two colors are both shades of blue, right? One is lighter and one is darker, but it falls under the same general category of a color. Well, if your native language is Russian, Greek, or Turkish, you might be thinking, what do you mean? These are obviously two completely different colors. In Greek, for example, this is
γαλάζιο,
and this is
μπλε.
Or you know how it's pretty tricky to describe smells? In Western languages, we usually just describe them based on different objects that the smell reminds us of. So we'll say, oh, this smells smoky or fruity, or this smells like a banana, but we don't have an abstract word that describes the smell by itself. Unlike this indigenous language in Malaysia, called Jahai, that has about 12 categorical words for smell that can't even be translated into English. And a study has shown that Jahai speakers were able to describe smells with just one word that English speakers needed several words for, and they also mutually agreed on which smell fit which word. Or, one last example from my everyday life, a lot of Germans, when they speak English, will say something like, "Whew, it's so hot in the sun. I'm gonna sit down in the shadow over there." Even though in English, you would usually refer to that as shade. Shadow is only used when it's particularly your shadow, or the shadow of an object. So I think generally when it's smaller, I can't even explain it really because this is a concept that I had to learn myself when I first came here because it doesn't really exist in the German language. Both shade and shadow translate to Schatten in German. So in our minds, we perceive this as the exact same thing. It's one and the same concept. I personally think it's fascinating how language can shape the way we think about something. Maybe that'll be worth a dedicated video at some point. Now, whether or not this actually influences the way we think about race in Germany, I don't know. But I feel like this could play a role. Aside from that, a big reason for this difference certainly goes back to the fact that in a European country like Germany, a social category that's solely based on physical features such as color of skin simply wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. Because most Europeans are rather light-skinned and share similar facial features, yet we don't all share the same culture, language, and history. So it makes sense that social categories tend to be based more on those cultural differences. In the US, on the other hand, whether you were a white immigrant from England or a white immigrant from the Netherlands didn't make nearly as big of a difference historically as whether your family chose to migrate to the US from anywhere in Europe or whether they were brought here from Africa as slaves or were Native Americans. For centuries, skin color and other physical features were the determining factors in regards to the rights you were granted and the wealth you were able to accumulate in this country. Now, please don't get me wrong, none of this means that racism and discrimination don't exist in Germany. They definitely do. But I think even that sometimes tends to be based more on things like religion, certain countries of origin, and cultural backgrounds. Which doesn't make the discrimination any better, of course. It's still just as fucked up. And the murders by the neo-Nazi organization NSU in the early 2000s, the attack of a synagogue in Halle in 2019, or the far-right extremist shootings in Hanau in 2020 are just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, Germany just published new numbers a few days ago showing that politically motivated crime was at an all-time high last year, and right-wing extremist hate crimes, such as anti-Semitic attacks or attacks on refugees, make up the biggest portion of that. And maybe you saw in the news or in my Instagram story that just last week there was a viral video of a bougie-looking crowd on the German island of Sylt at a party chanting anti-immigrant slogans and even doing the Hitler salute while being filmed. This caused a huge outrage because it showed that racism in Germany has somehow become more socially accepted in the last few years, to the point where some people aren't even ashamed anymore to shout stuff like this openly at a party and into a camera. Also, quick disclaimer, I'm not trying to say that Black people in Germany don't experience racism solely based on their appearance. That definitely happens too, and I'm not trying to invalidate any of those experiences. Now that I've lived in the US for a few years, I've also definitely learned a lot about how much of a cultural aspect there is to being Black in the US. Like, I knew that there were music genres that were traditionally Black, that were invented by Black people, and dance genres and those types of things, but I didn't know before that there were typical Black names and typical white names in the US, for example, or specific holidays that the Black community celebrates, or how widespread African American vernacular English is as a dialect. And unlike most dialects, it's not bound to one specific region necessarily, even though of course there are regional differences within this dialect as well, but it's so prevalent all over the US and plays a huge role in pop culture too. I also didn't know before that in return, there were all these cliches of a stereotypical white person or a typical white family, like that they can't handle spicy food, for example, or they listen to country music. In Germany, the closest equivalent to that would probably be the stereotype of the Allmann. Or back when I was younger, it was also sometimes referred to as the German potato. You know, just your stereotypical German person who wears functional clothing while riding their bike to work, of course wearing a helmet and safety reflectors, who follows every rule to the T, and also makes sure that others follow the rules, splits the bill according to who ate how much down to the last cent, and likes to clap along to their favorite Schlager music. Now, of course, this is just a heavy stereotype, but even here, the stereotype is more about the typical German and not so much about the typical white person. Now, there isn't really an equivalent in Germany to what Black culture is in the US. I mean, of course not, they're two different countries. But maybe you could say that people with a migration background have kind of a similar role in Germany. There's a trans-regional German dialect called Kiezdeutsch, for example, that was mainly influenced by people with foreign roots, and most of the big artists in the German rap scene are from that community as well. So in summary, it's possible that one advantage of the German approach to race is that people don't think in racial categories as much. The biggest downside of the German approach, on the other hand, is definitely that there is virtually no data to base any type of anti-discrimination policies on and measure how effective they are. We don't even have reliable numbers on how many people of racial minority groups even live in Germany. All we have is estimates. And Germany isn't alone with this. In fact, most of the world's wealthiest countries don't collect any type of racial or ethnic identity data. This also includes countries like France, Italy, Japan, or Norway, for example. This UN report on racial injustice against Black people from 2021 heavily criticized this and said that countries need to start collecting comprehensive data on race and ethnic origin in order to fight racism. Countries like Canada, the UK, Ireland, or Mexico are already doing this, just like the US. But because the German government wasn't collecting any data, independent anti-discrimination organizations have started a survey called Afrozensus that collects data about race, ethnicity, and people's experiences with discrimination in Germany. Daniel Gemera, chairman of the Berlin-based organization Each One Teach One, is the one who had the idea for this project. This DW article quotes him as follows. "Politicians look at numbers," he says, noting that more evidence of racism is needed to get policymakers to act. The first set of data was collected in 2020. You can see the results on their website afrozensus.de, and if you want to participate in the next German Afrozensus survey, you can sign up for that as well. By the way, even though statistics like these are generally illegal in Germany, there are exceptions to the rule, like in this case. And actually, just last year, in 2023, the German government did take action themselves and for the first time published a situation report on racism in Germany that was based on a representative survey. Now, while it makes a lot of sense that racial statistics are necessary in order to make racism and discrimination visible and tackle it, we also know that this type of data has a historical record of being abused. The Nazis, for example, used ethnic data from official records and tax returns in occupied countries to locate Jews and deport them to death camps. The same thing happened in France at the time under the Vichy regime, as well as in fascist Italy. And later, in the surveillance state of East Germany, the large network of the Stasi, the state security service, collected all kinds of information on people through espionage, which was then often used to prosecute, imprison, or blackmail citizens. The US too used racial data after the bombing of Pearl Harbor to target Japanese Americans, mostly on the West Coast, and move them to camps for the remainder of the war. And even today, there have been claims that racial data is used to people's disadvantage in the US. One example are the accusations against Harvard University and the University of North Carolina that went before the Supreme Court last year. The claims were that the universities discriminated against Asian American applicants during their admission process, and the Supreme Court ruled that the universities were, in fact, violating the Equal Protection Clause of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. This decision basically set a new precedent that, moving forward, will limit the option for universities to take race into consideration during the college admission process. Which sounds like a good thing at first, but we also know that institutions use this data to proactively include minorities, and research has shown that when race isn't being considered anymore, it typically leads to fewer Black, Latino, and Indigenous students being admitted to elite universities, which means that they end up becoming less diverse. So creating these type of records always comes with the risk that today or at some point in the future, they could potentially be abused. That's kind of a common concern among Germans in general, and one of the reasons why people in Germany care so much about data protection, because you never know how that data could be used against you in the future with new technology or a different political regime. Now, going back to the US, while I totally understand how these forms can help fight racism, I have been asking myself, doesn't it also kind of put these racial categories into people's heads to begin with when they're constantly being asked to place themselves in one of 5 boxes? I'm not sure when children typically have to answer the race question for the first time in the US. Maybe you can let me know in the comments below, but I would assume that this shows up on medical records pretty much since birth, right? So then kids probably witness their parents filling out these forms and selecting one of these categories for them. I mean, doesn't that automatically become a part of how they form their identity then? And if so, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Like, wouldn't it be better if color just didn't play a role in our heads at all and we focused more on seeing the individual person? Or is it necessary to learn about race from a young age in order to recognize racism when you see it? I would love to hear your thoughts on this, especially because I didn't have these experiences as a kid. As an outsider, it also always seemed a little weird to me that some of these categories are so insanely big. Like, one option for race is just Asian. I mean, that includes an entire continent. More than half of the world population is located in Asia. And why is there an ethnicity category that only asks for one single ethnicity, even though there are so many of them in the world? But that's actually a point that the US Census Bureau has been considering as well, and they just announced some changes to their forms for the next census in 2030. The biggest ones being that there will be a new category added for Middle Eastern or North African people, and that Hispanic or Latino won't be in a separate section about ethnicity anymore, but it'll be included in the regular options for race instead. Over the last almost 8 years that I've lived here in the US, I've definitely developed more of an awareness of race, and I understand how important it is to acknowledge white privilege and recognize racism for what it is. But I have to admit that sometimes I'm not sure if I like how my brain now seems to put people in certain boxes more quickly based on visual features without even knowing them or ever having talked to them. And I don't even mean boxes in a bad way, like that I think of stereotypes, but just the fact that I consciously pay attention to external features now. On the other hand, I know that it's important, but I also wish I could turn that back off sometimes. And in terms of how countries should approach this topic, it seems like there are pros and cons to both the German and the American way. So what's the right thing to do here? Is there one? What do you think? I would love for the comment section to be a place where you guys can share your opinions and experiences with this topic and these different approaches, especially if you're a person of color yourself or belong to another minority group. Obviously, I can't really speak from personal experience as a white person, but I'm sure many of you can. As always, please make sure to stay respectful and rational in the comments, and remember that everyone's experience is valid, even if it's different from the next person's experience. This is a huge topic, and there are definitely a lot of aspects that I didn't get to touch on in this video, but I hope that I was able to provide some context from a German perspective. And I would also definitely love to hear from my fellow Germans what your perception was like growing up and today. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to send over a super thanks, a coffee, or join the Patreon community. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like my content. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you next time. Tschüss!